Right, we're going to talk tomatoes. This is a great time of year to be getting tomatoes in because the days are getting a little bit longer. I always start my tomatoes, and indeed any fruiting things like squash, off on a very sunny windowsill. South facing is obviously best. As long as the days are getting warmer, that's when I start to put them in. So I put my first ones in about 2 weeks ago, so that would have been the end of the first week of March, and they're already starting to come up because they're sufficiently warm. So I'm going to show you how I pot my tomatoes. There's a general rule when you're potting seeds, is that the smaller the seed, the less soil it needs on top, or the other way of thinking of it is the larger the seed, the deeper it needs to go. So these are some of these paper pots that I've made previously, and they're absolutely perfect for this purpose. And they haven't got much depth to them, but tomatoes don't really need it at this moment. They'll produce longer roots later. So actually that one needs a little bit more. So the way I like to do them is actually keep them together in one tray, and then I know exactly what I'm working with. And you'll notice I'm slightly firming the soil down there. Now, tomato seeds are very small, quite fiddly. And I'm going to do this as one seed per pot. So what I'm going to do first is just make sure I put a little tiny depression just with my fingertip in the centre of the pot. And that just helps make sure that the seed goes towards the middle when you drop it in rather than on the edge. Not that it matters too much if you end up with the seed sprouting on the edge of your pot. One more. Oh no, two more. Now, tomatoes only need to go under 1 centimetre depth of soil. If you do them any deeper than that, they may well struggle to germinate. If you don't know what depths to put your seeds in at, I might recommend one of these two. You can't get this exact one anymore, this is very old as you can tell, but you can get similar things or simply look it up online. And I can't stress that you really need to follow these guidelines because you will find that if you put them in too deep, you will have no plants to show for it. And when I'm popping it in, just a little bit, just on top. A bit more in that one and that one. And when you pop your seeds in, it's important to actually firm them in properly. If you do not firm your seeds in as you go, they will not make proper contact with the soil. And the worst thing is that they won't then germinate. So once you've got your seeds in, do give them a thorough watering, and you'll notice that these pots actually have a lip on them, and that helps mean that the water just won't spill out everywhere. And when you're watering your seeds, you do need to keep the soil moist, but you don't want to keep it too damp, because if it's damp that will cause its own problems. So I'd highly recommend watering in the mornings, particularly if it's going to be a sunny day, and always check by using your finger, is the soil moist? Right, well, consider probably not watering it, maybe watering it later that day or possibly the next day. So now these are in, I would expect these to sprout hopefully within a couple of weeks on a sunny windowsill. When they are approximately 15-20 centimetres tall, they're actually ready to plant out. And you can do that into a greenhouse if you wish, or indeed you can actually eventually plant them outside. But if you're going to do that, you need to harden them off in a greenhouse or a sheltered spot in the garden first. And it might surprise you to learn that you can grow tomatoes outside in the UK, but it is possible as long as they're in a sunny spot and it's relatively sheltered. When growing tomatoes, you do actually need to get hold of a specialist fertiliser for tomatoes. So this is a mix that's high in both potassium and phosphorus and lower in nitrogen. So nitrogen's really for producing good leafy greens and good root systems and stems. But presuming you've got reasonable soil quality and you've used a decent compost to start with, what you actually need for tomatoes is phosphorus and potassium. So I'd recommend getting hold of some of this, and you're going to first use it whenever you plant your plants out into their final destination. Give them a dressing then, and make sure you follow the instructions on the packet as to how much fertiliser you should be using per square metre. You're going to put a little bit of fertiliser again when they start to show the fruits as the flowers are going over, and then I'd recommend doing it approximately once a month or so. You can do it a little bit more often, but I find once a month is more than sufficient, and it gives me a good crop and it saves me a little bit of money on some fertiliser. There's two distinct types of tomatoes. One's described as a cordon, and they're the ones you traditionally train up a cane in order to make them stand up. And there's also bush form tomatoes, which, if you read the descriptions, are apparently self-supporting. In my experience, they tend to flop all over the place. So I'd highly recommend that whatever type you go for, you end up using a bamboo stick, preferably something that's at least 1.5 metres long, so that you can put it firmly into the soil and also get a good amount of height on it. The other things you need to consider with tomatoes are the dreaded blight disease. So if you have yellowing leaves on any of your plants, or you have any mottled leaves, get rid of them as soon as possible and make sure you don't put them in the compost, because its chances are, particularly in the latter case with the mottling, that it's possibly blight, in which case you will spread it if you put it in the compost. So make sure you always practice good hygiene and pick up any leaves that have fallen off the plants as well, because these are where things like mildews and also other problems lurk. Top tip, never grow potatoes close to tomatoes. This is because they're the same family, and that means the likelihood of passing the diseases that affect one or other between them is greatly increased the closer they're grown together. So not that you'd be growing potatoes indoors anyway, so you can keep your tomatoes away from your potatoes nicely if you're growing them in a greenhouse and grow your potatoes outside. Otherwise, if you are doing an outdoor system, just give at least a couple of metres distance between them. And also, it's well worth bearing in mind that if you plant your tomatoes, or indeed your potatoes, too close together, the chances of them getting diseased are much greater, because there's going to be less airflow between them. One last thing on the subject of tomatoes, I believe that it's really hard to have too many tomatoes, and at the end of the year you might find that, sort of around about October time, you've got lots of green tomatoes that aren't ripening on the plants anymore, simply because the air temperature is no longer warm enough. So in which case, bring them inside, get rid of all the foliage, wash them carefully, dry them, and then pop them in a shallow container, shallow box, preferably with some absorbent material lining that box, and just leave them in a dark and cool place, and they will ripen over winter, and that will give you a supply of tomatoes throughout the autumn and going into the winter months. I've had them last as long as 3 months this way, so that keeps them going. Or alternatively, if you don't want to do that method, may I recommend turning them into a green tomato chutney.